Tree of Life Synagogue attack Robert Bowers back in court as both parties went over evidence it could be used in his trial. And for the first time, we're hearing alleged comments made by Bowers to arresting officers.
Yeah, let's get right to Channel 11's Gabriella DeLuca at the federal courthouse. Gabriella, take us through what happened here.
David and Lisa, some of that testimony that was shared today included anti-Semitic remarks that Bowers allegedly made as he was turning himself in. The defense team says that should not be used. Those statements should not be used in his trial. For several hours today, attorneys played nearly 70 radio calls between SWAT officers and dispatchers from the morning of the Tree of Life shooting. SWAT officers who testified relived the day from the first call about a shooter to when Robert Bowers turned himself in. While doing so, two officers testified that as Bowers crawled downstairs to turn himself in because he was shot, he allegedly said, "All these Jews need to die." Bowers' defense attorneys filed a motion to suppress anti-Semitic statements police say Bowers made as he was turning himself in. The officers also testified that they assumed there were multiple shooters inside the synagogue, so they made up a ruse and told Bowers they saw him and his buddy walking in on security cameras. Bowers allegedly told officers that must have been an expletive Jew and that he came by himself. Bowers was not in the courtroom today. The hearing will continue tomorrow morning, and ultimately the judge will decide if the statements will be admissible during the trial. Reporting live, Gabriella DeLuca, Channel 11 News.